I came to Kikori in 1956, age 8, and then Dad got a job. We worked for APC, which is now Oil Search, in a town called Kuru. We came up on the MV Bololo. We then flew on a Catalina down to Kikori, and then on a little canoe up to Kuru, and that's where the family came in 1956. And then, I mean, I was there. I can remember the aircraft and Red Adair coming in and blowing out the fires on the where the gas caught fire. He came and dynamited them and plugged them. But Dad got a job with the Australian government in Hagen, and we moved here in 1958 and lived 200 metres from where I'm sitting. So I used to walk from here to Oglebang, and I think it's 4 or 5 or 6 miles maybe. And in those days my father had the green government administrator push bike, and my mother had the woman's one, so we walked. But the Australian government gave a local guy named Anagundi, who was one of the big leaders, gave him a motorbike. He had a green administration motorbike, and he was dressed in his bark belt and his arse tanget, and he'd see me walking out on the road at 8 years old, and he'd say, "Begin in Yugowe." And I'd say, "Migo looking wandok blomi," and he'd say, "Kalap na holimpa skin diwai." And skin diwai means bark belt. So I'd hang in amongst his smelly arse grass, and out I'd go to see my mate. But you know, things like that, and in the old days, the traditional days here, the village, there were really big men. 1958, I think I'm 10 years old, so I'm in Mount Hagen. Threepence a week pocket money, one shop over here near Trukai, where Trukai is today, owned by Danny Lay. During the day we'd wander over there because DC-3s would fly in from Thursday Island with Kina shell, and we'd all sit there with the local people and learn how to pick a good Kina shell from a bad Kina shell. And when you think in those days, you worked on a private plantation, a Papua New Guinean got paid £1 a month. That was his salary, and that was 20 shillings, if you don't know. And they'd get an issue of a little slab of soap, a stick of tobacco, a razor blade, and a sheet of newspaper to wrap the tobacco in, and an issue of rice or cacao. So £1 meant the world, and as soon as they got the pound, they'd run off to a shop to convert it to coins, because the pound was paper, and if it rained, they had no way of keeping it dry, and you'd lose your pound. So that's why eventually the coins had holes in them, so that they could string them together. And then, of course, in 1960, there was no schools up here, and the Australian government sent us all off to school in Australia. So I was fortunate enough to go to the Gold Coast, to the Southport School, and did 6 years at Southport School. So from 1960 to 1966, I was at the Southport School, but in the meantime, Dad was transferred to Goroka. So 1966, when I left school and came back up here, Mum and Dad had split up, and I had to get a job to support the family, and Danny Lay gave me my first job. So I did 6 years working for Collins & Lay in Goroka, and during that time they didn't go too well, and I decided to leave and come back to Hagen and start my own business. So I came back here in January 73. And to give you an idea, when I started trading up here, a guy had come in with a £1 note, and he'd have it in his hand, and he'd have a bark belt on it, and he'd have arse tanget, which is leaves at the back to keep your arse covered, and he'd come into the shop, and I'd be serving in the shop, and he'd point to a tin of fish, and you get the tin of fish and you'd put it on the counter, and he'd give you the pound, and he wouldn't ask the price because it was meaningless, and you would give him the change in, you might give him a 10 bob note, which he didn't want, and some coins, and he'd look at that and have no idea what all that meant. But he got more back. So he struggled with the idea that I've given you a pound and I've got all this back. So then he'd point to some sugar, and he'd quickly point to the other half a pound note, because he wanted to get rid of that. So he'd give you that, and you'd give him back the change, and he'd put that there, and he'd go, good, still got a bit left, and he would keep doing it one by one and getting the change till the money had gone. And that's how, in the end, they struggled to work out what the value of money was. It was just, to them, it was a means to getting something, but they had no real idea what the value was. We worked on a plantation so that we could get knives, and we could get saucepans, and we could make our lives better. And measuring the cost was not necessarily that important. My partner and I ran what they called the Highland Labour Scheme, which all the plantations on the coast needed labour, because the people on the coast didn't want to work. So you'd get a plantation in Rabaul would ring up and say, I want 10 taris. So you'd set off and go and get 10 Tari people, put them on a truck and send them down to the coast, sign them up. You'd send them off, and you'd send them off with a piece of cloth called a lap-lap. They had nothing else. Nothing. They came with a bark belt, nothing else. And off they'd go. And they did a 2-year contract. And when they come back, they had a wife, they have guitars. They came back with a whole infrastructure to take back to the Highlands, and everybody wanted to go. Everybody wanted to go and work on the coast and see the salt water. I mean, that's what it was like in those days. I took a lot of people down to the coast who actually did that and marvelled at the fact that it was salt water. I mean, that's what it was as late as the 70s. A lot of people hadn't seen salt water. And that was how the trading was up here. I mean, the roads were good. Every Monday morning, all the villagers had to come out and work on the road. You got your section of the road, and it had to be perfect. And there had to be a footpath, and there had to be flowers. And all the bridges had a house over them to stop the bridges from rotting. And that was the village had to keep that piece of road going. And the piece of road was so good, as I said, Darryl Manton, my partner, had a Rolls Royce. Good Morning stores. He had a Mercedes. Phil Frame had an Alpha Spider in Goroka. You know, it was TAA and Ansett were running up here. All the air hostesses were foreign girls. It was a lovely time. As a young bloke growing up here, until independence, it was a wonderful time. After independence, it got a bit hard to live, a bit hard to live here with the R&R. Because the other thing too, which a lot of people don't realise, was prior to independence, you had to have a licence to trade with natives, and I hated that. If you like the look of a native girl, and I say native in a derogatory manner because that's the way it was, if you like the look of a native girl and you were to fraternise with her, you were deported. Private sector, you may as well leave. You may as well leave. So it didn't help to integrate. And when you think about it, I was taught to drive by a Papua New Guinean. You know, I couldn't invite him into the sports club to have a drink. You know, you couldn't invite your Chinese friends into the sports club to have a drink. That's the way it was in those days. And even private enterprise to government, government wore white. Private enterprise, we weren't seen in a good light. The district commissioner in Kundiawa had a party, I crashed it, for his daughter that I got on well with. I got asked by him to leave because I was private enterprise. We all accepted it. I had to accept it. I mean, you walk into the sports club and the district commissioner, his name was on a chair. If you went up to the bar to get a drink at 4 minutes, you got no chance, because that's when the government knocked off. And if you were private enterprise, you turn up at 5 or 6. It was a whole different world. It was a whole different world. And not a very, for me, who was a young guy growing up in PNG with PNG people, I resented it terribly, all this colonial stuff. I resented it terribly. And after independence, it's probably why I did so well, because my mates supported me, and my mates were Papua New Guineans, because the foreigners had fled. So I had a lovely time. Independence for me was a positive period, because I think at that time there were about 75,000 expats prior to independence. And there was lots of threats, nationalistic feelings, and a lot of the businesses, the colonial businesses, had decided to go. And I was picking up shops for little or no money. And I was very young, and I didn't belong in the colonial era anyway, because most of my friends were Papua New Guineans. So I welcomed independence. I wasn't scared of it. I welcomed it. And it really gave me a huge kickstart, because I was then able to work with the local people. I bought a lot of shops in their name, borrowed money in their name, because there was a government organisation called NIDA that wouldn't let you, after independence, own shops. And the only way I could grow was to get some of my friends. Simon Correll was one, and I took him along to the bank, got him a loan to buy 2 shops, agreed to give him a 25% rate of return, paid the shops off in 4 years, and he continued to lease them to me. So independence for me was just a marvellous time, and allowed the PNG people to start to grow. And I suspect when they say, what did you get knighted for, was for services to commerce. And I think, if you want to be brutally frank, I helped a hell of a lot of Papua New Guineans become very wealthy, but in doing so, did it for my own personal reasons. But it wasn't only that. I mean, to grow forward, we're one country. I've felt a part of the country and still do. And one of the ways PNG custom is you have to share. You don't do everything for yourself. You do it for, not the community, but you do it for a group of people.
And it's reciprocal.
And it's reciprocal. You get big respect, you get lifted up and called a big man if you share your wealth or share your good times. And Brian Hegney, Collins and Lay bought him out in the Chimbu area and pushed him back to here. And Brian Hegney, when I was a young bloke working at Collins and Lay, he would come in with his leather briefcase, open it, pull out his cans of soda water and his black label Johnny Walker, and say to me, son, go and get the ice. Well, we don't have any here. Go and find ice, son. If you want me to buy anything, go and find ice. I'd go and find ice, and I'd have to drink whiskey, and I couldn't drink whiskey. And the only way I could serve him as a young boy at Collins and Lay was getting half pissed. By the time I'd finished serving Brian Hegney, I'd had to go home because I was largely legless. But Brian Hegney, I eventually took over from him in Chimbu at a place called Mauro. And when I took over from Brian, Brian had a harem. He married a local Chimbu lady, or should I say a few. And Brian Hegney, to get his cargo to Guinea or to Dumina, he would give it to carriers, and I took over from Brian in Marrow and put in Marrow doesn't exist anymore, by the way, but we had a bakery there and we controlled about 15 shops throughout Chimbu. Collins and they did very well in those days with these shops because we took out the cargo and then bought the coffee on the way back, and that's how we traded in those days. Andy Flower, very colourful character. I bought his shop in Tari. He was Hooley Traders, and that's how I ended up with the island in Milne Bay off Samurai Island. I bought it from Hooley Traders, and I bought it from Andy Flower over a few drinks, and I still own it today. It was very competitive in those days. The thing was to have a liquor license, and the few of them that had a liquor license stopped the rest of us from getting a liquor license. But what I did was decided to sell chickens. So I imported from Steggles, Australia, soup chickens, which were called boiler fowl. And they were huge and full of fat and frozen. And when we go to the Pioneer Club for a few drinks after work, Andy Flower and Hegney and all the rest of it say, I sold 5,000 cartons of beer today, made $1 a carton. You know, one day we'll let you get a liquor license. And I'd say, no, it's all right. I understand my place. I'll just stick to what I'm doing, and, you know, congratulations, you made a lot of money today. What they didn't know was I'd probably sold 30,000 chickens on the same day and made $2 a chicken profit, and never told them a bloody word. I just kept my mouth shut. So there was swings and roundabouts back then. You know, I played rugby with a guy, Iligeno, who ended up being the ombudsman, and he's now on the advisory board to the referendum in Bougainville. And I saw him at the airport this morning. And I said to him, you must be my age, because we played rugby together. And he said, John Dunlop said, I'm 70 in May. And he said, I'm 70 on the 1st of July. And I said, well, I'm 70 on the 19th of July. So we worked it out that I'm the young boy. But, you know, there's not many of them left alive. And most of them, like Paul Pora, who had 18 wives, his real name was Paul Schwartz, because he was mixed. I can remember Wingty running around as a uni student. You know, all these people are very much my junior. People like William Doom, I never heard of him. He's so young, you know, he's a latecomer. You know, but most of the politicians today are the senior guys, Peter Barter, and the senior guys, Samari, they've all retired. Julius Chan's one of the originals. You know, and you've got a whole new breed coming along now. But interestingly, when I sold Collins and Lay and took a share in Steamies, I got together with Simon Corowa and Ron Jenkins, and we bought out Simon Corowa's Diddyman business, and we called it Chemica. And that's ex-Simon Corowa. Ron Jenkins is ex-ICI Chemicals. And what we decided to do is we sat down in a room and we said, no computers, no foreigners, no air conditioning, nothing with a use-by date on it. And that was our main criteria. And today, that's still where we stand. No foreigners, no scanning, no fancy computers, and we make money. And we can compete with other Papua New Guineans, and we can compete with the Chinese. It's very easy. But if you try to set yourself up as a complicated company, you're going to find it very difficult to trade in the country today. Work with the people, and it's surprising what you'll get back in return. You know, and I suppose it's the old story: when you do something good, nobody thinks about it. If you do something bad, it spreads around the town like wildfire. So better you do more good than bad.